in Arlington in Northern Virginia. So we're a nonprofit. We were founded in 2003 by a bunch of civic leaders who were really concerned that Arlington was becoming a place where only the wealthy could afford to live. And so they got together around one of our current board members' kitchen tables and said, you know, we need an organization that can really help focus the policy conversations on the affordable housing that we need. And this was sort of part of an evolution of the smart growth adoption that the county had taken throughout the 70s and 80s. So we're a policy organization, but we do policy and advocacy, but we also do a lot of public education. And so I'll talk to you about a little bit of a few of our public education efforts that I've been involved in over the past several years. So like I said, you know, engaging and educating the public is one of the biggest and most visible roles that AHS plays in the community. We do, you know, I'll mention that there's like probably two different ways that we really focus our education efforts. One is on a series of forums that we run. You might have heard about the Lecky forums. These are big, relatively high-profile events where we try to get high-profile speakers to focus on some really current topics and get the attention of Arlington civic leaders, advocates, as well as policymakers and staff from around the region. We've tended to focus in many of these over the past several years on some more cutting edge type issues like missing middle housing, our current hot topics. Last year we focused on Minneapolis, and we brought the housing director from Minneapolis into Arlington to speak to us about what they had done around single family zoning. So we've gotten a lot of benefits from being able to bring in these high profile speakers. You see here Tim Kaine. He was our keynote speaker in 2018, where we talked about housing discrimination and segregation. So I think one of the things that we've learned about doing those events is that the profile of the speakers really helps get greater attention, both the public sector, who pays a little bit more attention when you have people like Tim Kaine coming to talk, but also the general public. And I think that a lot of what we do in advocating in Arlington is not only talking to the elected officials who we may need to sway a little bit, but we definitely need to talk to the general public, who are then going to be talking to those public officials about whether they support affordable housing. And so this public education work that we do is really a key component. So the other big thing that we've done in public education that I'll talk about today is our Arlington for Everyone campaign. And this is becoming even more relevant over the last few weeks and years, for that matter. So this is a campaign. You can see here the logo with the tree and some of our yard signs. This campaign really uses storytelling and bright and colorful graphics, things like yard signs, bumper stickers, buttons, and t-shirts. And we have fun events like happy hours, and we go and have tables at home shows and fairs. And what we're really trying to do with this is talk to people in Arlington. The yard signs, I think, have been particularly helpful, although we are a smart growth community, so we need our next round of things. We're having not just yard signs, but window signs for all those people who are in condos and apartments with no yards. They've given us that feedback. This is just basically trying to create a way for people to express their support for the diverse community that Arlington really wants to be, but also the understanding that in order to create that diverse and inclusive community it's in Arlington's mission as a county, or vision as a county, that we need to have a diversity of housing types and committed long-term affordability in order to make that happen. So we have been running that for the last few years, and we're actually right now in the process of reconsidering the messaging and the purpose of that campaign in light of all the current events that we've had, both with our twin crises of the racial unrest and the COVID crisis. Stuart mentioned missing middle housing. We have been working on missing middle housing. This is something that I thought that the organization should take on when I first joined us in 2016. AHS and many of the affordable housing organizations or groups that focus on anything called affordable housing have for a very long time, and was my experience in my career as well, worked on what I would call traditional housing issues. So how do you finance affordable housing, the low-income housing tax credit? How do you get as much density as you possibly can, because you need that density in order to make the housing more affordable for the developers, particularly nonprofit developers. And we thought around 2016, the conversation was starting to pick up in a couple places around the country around the concept of missing middle housing. Because we don't have a lot of time, I'll just say that one of the things that we focused on at that time was on design. And you can see here, and it's actually in my background, is the design gallery that we created. And I'll zoom in on a few of them so that you can see some up-close examples. We thought that design was one of the things that single-family homeowners were going to be very influenced by. And so we did this gallery. It was actually on display at the county the county's government's offices for a few months. And sometimes I describe this as kind of a charm offensive. We wanted people to say, oh, look, I'd like to live next door to that. It's sort of the opposite, we've been talking about YIMBY versus NIMBY. Sometimes design can take that a long way, and so that was what we were hoping, and we were able to really start building a network of people in the community who understand the concept and can now start talking about the implementation side of how do we do it. Another theme that we have used in our public education, and I mentioned this before with our Tim Kaine as our speaker, is history. And particularly, we have focused on the history of and the legacy of discrimination and segregation in Arlington and similar communities, and how that legacy is still around today. So we tell stories about things like the segregation walls and the racially restrictive covenants, both of which actually still exist in Arlington. And that's been really eye-opening for many Arlingtonians to hear. We, at our event in 2018, we did sort of a deep dive into some of the history and found out about fair housing drives and apartment segregation marches that were done in Northern Virginia, and just shared with people some of those stories. The restrictive covenants, this is an example from one of my former board members' homes. They're pretty egregious, and when people start to see that those things are still there, it really kind of makes them take a second look and understand a little bit more. So having focused on this a few years ago has been helpful, again, for keeping people aware of some of the circumstances that we're going through right now and what could potentially be done about it. The last theme that I wanted to talk about is our approach to using data, something that we don't shy away from. We often get invited to go talk to local civic groups and meetings, and the data that we use, we try to make it as visually appealing to help people really understand something that is pretty complex. The housing market is an extremely complex thing to understand, and people have a lot of misunderstandings about it. And so one of the things that people do understand is big numbers that change, such as the loss of affordable market rentals. Arlington has lost 20,000 market affordable rentals, affordable at 60% of AMI, for instance. And other data like the regional housing shortfall is something that has grasped people's attention. And then I'll just end by saying that we very often put all of this into a framework of there being no one-size-fits-all strategy. A lot of what we do when we do this pushback is, we're pushing back on people who have seen one thing and think that that one thing is going to be what's coming to be next door to them. So, oh, we're increasing density. That means that there's going to be a high rise next door to me. But we try to make the case that that what you see in one place isn't necessarily what's coming down to your street. It could be anything from accessory dwellings and home sharing to missing middle housing to some really moderate density options, as well as higher density that we would see in transit corridors. And all of this is part of our affordable housing message, very consistent with the Coalition for Smarter Growth and their Smart Growth message. So I will end there. I'll put my contact info up, and would be glad to take questions if we have time. I know it's 6 o'clock, so.
Oh, a couple more minutes over.
All right. Well, I was just going to say, that's really, I mean, it's amazing education work you do. And I know that other jurisdictions in Northern Virginia and elsewhere continue to grapple with sort of how do we make the case to folks who just don't understand around this messaging. There were a couple of questions that came in through the chat. Douglas Stewart was asking, and I think you hit on it a little bit, but what is your target audience within Arlington, the Arlington public, for your educational programs? I know you mentioned civic groups and meetings. Is that generally the focus? Is it more expansive than that?
No, we have a couple of different audiences depending on what, with which approach we're using. So, and we've had to sort of be a little bit strategic about this and realize that we aren't always going after the same audience. So when we do some of our big events that are AHS labeled, and we've gotten, I think last year we had about 180 people come to the Central Library in Arlington to talk to the Minneapolis housing director. Those events have some general public in them, but they are also, those events are particularly geared towards the housing community and the civic stakeholder community, I would say, the civic leadership, planning commissioners, housing commissioners. We even had a DC City Council person and her staff come. And then we get a lot of professionals. Those we tend to use to have events during the work week. And what we're doing there is we're really kind of helping equip those housing organizations and advocates and people with the information that they need to be good advocates on their behalf. A lot of them are very focused on the day-to-day activities, and they don't necessarily have the luxury of stepping out and thinking about innovations and best practices and things. And so we use that. But then our other events, so I would say that not necessarily events that we hold, but when we go to events. So a big part of our public education is me and some other people that work with me going out to civic association meetings. There was one where Stuart and I had to brainstorm on how to deal with a particularly difficult NIMBY situation last year, where I was speaking at a civic association, and so that we go to where people are already going to be, and we find a lot more people who would never have come to anything that was called affordable housing, but we're able to touch and hopefully switch up some of their thoughts on how they approach affordable housing as an issue.
Great. That's all pretty amazing outreach. We're going to go, I guess, one more minute before we get dragged back to the main group. There was one other question Chris Miller asked. How do communities ensure that affordable housing is targeted to meet local and not necessarily broader regional demand? Is that something you address in any way or thought about?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of different things in that. So, I mean, the housing, so I'll just say the housing market is regional. And what we've got going on right now, especially after the Council of Governments issued their report last year, gosh, I've probably been I can't, I think I might be in a time warp. It might have been, no, I think it was last year. The Council of Governments issued a report, and all of the regional governments signed on to say that they all need to do their part in increasing the overall supply of affordable housing. So the reality is that housing markets are regional, and all areas need to do a lot more, including Arlington, even though some people say we already do a lot. So, you know, I think the last time I heard a number, one of the affordable housing properties that leased up had about 70 to 80% of the people who were new residents there came from Arlington. And so that was serving a local need. But the other thing that we also need to think about when talking about serving local needs versus regional needs is that the county discovered that local preferences, like, you know, we want this housing to go to somebody who already lives here as a requirement, for instance. Well, that runs up on the Fair Housing Act, and for good reason. If you think about it, Arlington is a much whiter community than the rest of the region, and particularly some of our neighbors, Alexandria, DC, Prince George's County. And if we put up barriers to people who don't live in Arlington from living in affordable housing in Arlington, then that is a pretty clear violation of anti-discrimination rules. And so that is, that's what the rules are. And once we sort of found out about that and learned it, it made a lot of sense. And we use that in some of our education too.
Thanks, Michelle. This is Stuart. We're about to go back in the main room. I think one of the other things that we had from COG, if I can get it in real quickly, is they did want at least 75% of the new housing and jobs to be near metro or in activity centers.
Right.
Some of the activity centers we have challenges with because they're far out without metro, and they're too large, like in parts of Loudoun and Prince William. So we're going to have to address that. But at least COG is recognizing they need to be in more walkable urban places to provide a lot of the additional housing that we need. So
right. And having those numbers available has to show that there is a huge supply gap has been very helpful to me, I think, in some of these community conversations, to show them that it's not just an advocate saying we need more, it's the Council of Governments that says it.
Yeah, and their planning directors did a great job in negotiating that. All right, back to the main session for wrap up. Thanks, Michelle.